Next up, we have AdAlta, trading under the ASX code 1AD, and their market cap around 15 million. They are a clinical stage biotechnology company using its iBody technology platform to solve challenging drug targeting problems and generate a promising new class of single domain antibody-enabled protein and cell therapeutics with the potential to treat some of today's most challenging medical conditions. Joining us today is AdAlta CEO and MD, Tim Oldham. Welcome back, Tim, and over to you.
Thank you, Paul, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be presenting to you today and sharing the progress we're making towards closing in on some pretty significant clinical and partnering milestones. And in fact, most of my remarks today will focus on the new clinical data that we've just released earlier this week. If we can move forward 2 slides, please. Just a reminder, Paul has already described the purpose of AdAlta. Our iBody technology is designed to produce novel protein and cell therapeutics. Our mission in life is to do what traditional antibody drugs cannot. Our iBodies are capable of hitting drug targets and formats that those traditional monoclonal antibodies have been unable to do. Our business can be thought of in 2 parts. Our discovery business that essentially creates an inventory of useful iBody candidates that could be then combined into a variety of different product formats. These can be done by ourselves or partnered. The real value comes as we convert these into products through the product development side of our business. Our lead program that I'll focus on today is AD214, which is being developed in the field of fibrosis. But we do have a very exciting immuno-oncology pipeline as well. If we move on to the next slide. Yeah, why should investors be thinking about AdAlta? We've got real near-term momentum happening that's creating real opportunities for significant value accretion through transaction and clinical milestones. We've got a really attractive current valuation. Remember our market cap of 15 million, and hold that in your mind when you see the deal comparators for AD214-like assets. We're accelerating towards a return on our AD214 investment through transactions that will enable us to finance the phase 2 program of this study, of this asset. And then we have this exciting pipeline of other assets and opportunities, both in-house and potentially in-licensed, that will follow on behind AD214. Next slide, please. So we have 3 core strategies. The first and most important one is realizing the value of our lead asset, AD214, generating a return for our shareholders. That will then enable us to accelerate the progress of our internal iBody-enabled CAR T-cell therapies and PET imaging programs, and will also enable us to further invest in both the iBody platform and a complementary product and technology pipeline that's potentially in-licensed and builds out the clinical stage, the clinical pipeline behind AD214. Next slide, please. So I'll focus today on AD214. It's providing new hope for fibrotic disease patients. So what is fibrotic disease? What is the impact that it has? Fibrosis is scarring of an internal organ that destroys the function of that organ. In the case of lung fibrosis, this prevents patients from breathing. On the next slide, you'll see a summary of an interview that I was privileged to do with Bill Van Nierop, who's one of the really rare survivors of idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis or lung fibrosis. And you can see here that he describes the symptoms as basically an ongoing struggle to breathe freely. Worse, this is an insidious disease that's invisible, poorly understood, with significant mental health aspects to it as well. And patients with IPF, on average, will die within 3 to 4 years of diagnosis. There is no good treatment for this disease today, despite 2 drugs on the market that sell for about $4 billion globally. Next slide, please. AdAlta has invested $45 million over almost a decade to develop AD214 to a really compelling value proposition as a new alternative for these patients in desperate need of an alternative outcome. AD214 is now progressed through phase 1 trials and is fully prepared for phase 2. And it is poised to enter phase 2 trials as the only product in the IPF pipeline offering antibody-like drug precision, on one of only 3 targeting a novel mode of action where to date there has not been a clinical failure. So good mode of action basis, compelling as the only antibody therapeutic, which really illustrates the power of the iBody platform. The next slide will show the work that we've done over the last decade or so, culminating in the second of our phase 1 clinical trials, the results of which were reported earlier this week. The next slide shows in more detail what we've done with our phase 1 clinical trials. Our first phase 1 trial tested the safety of single doses of AD214 and then multiple doses up to 5 milligrams per kilogram delivered intravenously. We then did a lot of work that showed us that the target dose for phase 2 was 10 milligrams per kilogram administered every 2 weeks. And so our extension study, which we've just completed, was designed to test the safety and pharmacokinetics availability of the drug over that 10 milligram per kilogram dose administered every 2 weeks. We also added a 4th dose to test the effect of anti-drug antibodies on the drug and really to verify that they were not going to have any effect on the potential activity of the drug. The results of the study were really excellent from our perspective and are summarized on the next slide. We were aiming to do 3 things. Firstly, test the safety of the drug, and we found that multiple doses of IV AD214 were really well tolerated. There were no dose-limiting toxicities and only mild adverse events. This outcome establishes the safety profile necessary to advance this dose into phase 2 clinical studies. The second objective was to ensure that the availability of the drug as measured by, or what we call pharmacokinetics, and the activity of the drug, which we call pharmacodynamics, was consistent across multiple doses, and it was in line with our model predictions that give us confidence that the availability and the activity of the drug supports the potential efficacy of that phase 2 dose. And thirdly, we wanted to determine and demonstrate that the presence of anti-drug antibodies at low levels did not affect the availability and activity of the drug. Most biological proteins generate an immune response. What we want to do is minimize that immune response. And in the case of AD214, we know that anti-drug antibody response is very, very low. And the results we've just presented show that at the phase 2 target dose, they have no effect on PK and PD, and therefore are unlikely to detract from the clinical safety or efficacy of this molecule. Those 3 objectives of this study were exactly the questions that larger biopharmaceutical partners have wanted to know. Is this target phase 2 dose safe? Does it have the potential to be effective? And are the anti-drug antibodies going to have an impact? And the results therefore comprehensively address their questions, not only positioning us to move into phase 2, but also positioning us to advance those partnering discussions in the near term. The next 2 slides illustrate a little bit of that data that's come out. This slide shows the availability of the drug as measured by the maximum concentration in the blood and the total availability in the blood on the right-hand side. And you can see between the red and the blue that between dose 1 and dose 4, the values are exactly the same. And this was really critical to demonstrate that the anti-drug antibodies were not having an effect. The next slide shows the activity of the drug, in this case as measured by the levels of white blood cells, which increase very briefly after administration of the drug. Again, consistent results between dose 1 and dose 4. We also studied the blocking of the target receptor and showed that we can maintain the level of blocking of CXCR4, the drug's target, for the duration of that 2-week window at levels that we believe are necessary for efficacy. So again, confirming what we thought, which was this drug has the potential to be effective at 10 milligrams per kilogram administered every 2 weeks. And that 2-week gap is important because we know that's the minimum gap we need to have to ensure that there is clinical adoption of this molecule. So what happens from here? On the next slide, we've summarized our financing strategy, which is either to co-develop this asset with private funding in an asset-specific vehicle or to out-license it to larger pharmaceutical companies. Those strategies are progressing in parallel at the moment. We're already sharing the data with an active pipeline we've been cultivating up until this point, and we should have feedback on their reactions to that in the near term. The product development strategy, once we have the financing in place, is to develop the IV version of AD214 through phase 2, and in parallel to develop a subcutaneous version of the drug, which will be much more convenient for patients in the long run. And that we will then have a choice of which formulation we take into phase 3 studies. The next slide shows what's the point of all of this. This gives us some idea of the value that large pharmaceutical companies are attaching to IPF assets. And you can see that over the last 2 years, there have been a dozen or so transactions with upfront payments in excess of $45 million US. Gives you some idea of the value of these assets. And remember, that compares with our current market capitalization of just 15 million. So we think that there is significant value in this asset to be unlocked, and a transaction will help us do that. Speaking of unlocking the value in the iBody pipeline, just recapping our overall pipeline, which is 2 slides down the track from here, please. AD214, of course, is our lead asset. We do have an active CAR T cell therapy pipeline, which we think is a really important application for the iBody platform going forward. We're very excited about the progress we're making there. And we have our ongoing collaboration with GE Healthcare to develop PET imaging agents for immuno-oncology. The next slide summarizes our milestones coming up in 2024, highlighting that we've just achieved the first one, which was completing the phase 1 extension study that enables us to access progress to phase 2 and financing strategies. The details of this slide can be seen in the presentation we lodged with the ASX earlier today. The last slide shows the foundations that we have in place for growth. Our lead asset is now heading to phase 2 in a $4.3 billion market and substantially de-risked by the phase 1 extension study readouts we've just seen. The partnering window is well and truly open to help us finance those phase 2 programs. And we have an amazing pipeline of other assets working through the diligence processes that our experienced team is capable of executing. So our contact details are on the next slide, and Paul, I'll hand over now to see if there are any questions from our audience.
Thanks, Tim. Lots of questions. I'll try and get through as many as I can, but if I can't answer all of them, if you could maybe answer them after you finish, that would be great.
Will do.
First question is, what's the status of potential partner discussions for AD214, and when can we expect some news on this front?
So we've been cultivating a pipeline of potential partners for many years. We have conducted with several of them diligence to the point where they have a degree of comfort with the asset so far, but they needed to see the results of the phase 1 extension study, which we've released this week. That is now in the hands of those potential partners. They're continuing their evaluation. Unfortunately, I'm unable to say how long that will take and what sort of transaction will evolve. It's not in our interests, our shareholders' interests, or our interests to be disclosing anything about timelines or deal terms at this point. I know that's frustrating, but in the long run, that's the way the process will need to work. We are confident, and I hope I'm answering Graham's question here as well. We are confident that we have access to various sources of financing to ensure that we can do the best possible deal. And we are confident that we're on track to execute a substantial transaction in the relatively near term.
Thanks, Tim. And can you elaborate on the potential market size for the treatment of fibrotic diseases?
So AD214 is being developed primarily or initially for idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. This is a $4 billion market today with the 2 drugs that don't work particularly well, is forecast to grow to $5 billion by 2028. We also have excellent preclinical data suggesting the drug may be active in kidney fibrosis. This is potentially a $10 billion market. We have early data suggesting there may be activity in eye fibrosis. This is a $16 billion market, and fibrosis is the largest cause of blindness in Western markets today. And then we're also exploring some activities in cancer with our collaboration with GPCR Therapeutics in Korea. That'd be $1 billion per indication there. So certainly multiple multi-billion-dollar indication opportunities. The $4 billion one we're going after to start with is just the tip of the iceberg potentially.
Got you. A question here: if finance for phase 1 is granted, will it be possible to have phase 2 this year, as we're only at the beginning of the year?
We will not be able to commence the phase 2 program this year. The financing that we will be raising will include the cost of actually manufacturing the drug for the phase 2 trial. That's a 9-month process on its own right there. So we would anticipate that the phase 2 program, if we financed it tomorrow, we would be able to commence in 2025, and that it would be complete in about 2.5 years after commencing.
And just last one here for you, Tim. Does having orphan drug status accelerate FDA approvals?
In the long run, it does. It leads to a couple of advantages. The first thing it does is give us greater access and greater to consultations with the FDA around designing the programs, particularly the later stage programs. It does result in an accelerated approval process, and it provides significant tax advantages for our ultimate commercialization partner, which is really where the big commercial value of an orphan drug designation sits for us.
Tim, as always, absolute pleasure. We'll be watching your story very, very closely. It looks like you've got plenty on your hands at the moment, and we'd love to get you back on in the second half.
Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Tim.